It feels like every week there's a new reboot or a new revival or a new something trying to trade off the popularity of what's gone before. However, as exciting as these prospects often are, they rarely land with the impact that fans hope for. This constant longing for nostalgia is the theme of this episode, as we discuss why we're so desperate to hold on to the past and whether it's possible to do so while also being relevant today. Welcome to Pop Politics. I'm Damien Lewarden.
I'm Mitchell Eckhurst.
And I'm Rebecca Hill's-Duty.
So, if the audience isn't hungry for nostalgia, then at the very least, the content mill is determined to deliver it. I think to some degree that ties into what we were talking about last week with the idea of mega brands, because the success of those is, I think, a part of what drives this desire to just keep digging up the past and digging up old properties and giving them a brand new coat of paint. But I think we'll come back to that later because I want to start with a different question, which is the one that you proposed a bit earlier in the week, Rebecca, which is how do you go about reviving a nostalgic property, or how do you think we should go about reviving those older properties?
The problem I have with a lot of current revivals of older nostalgic properties is that they don't seem to actually be interested in reviving it on its own terms. Instead, it seems to be used as a kind of like disguise for another idea. Um, so these original ideas are kind of shoved inside a nostalgic property in order to hide the fact that it's a different concept to the original nostalgic property. A very recent example that has forcefully come to my attention was that Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers trailer, which I can't figure out who that's for. Because it seems to be aimed at children, but children are not going to remember the original, which was from the 80s. And it's like, why can't we just, like, let original ideas stand on their own merits instead of cloaking them in an IP which doesn't fit? The Robocop movie from a few years ago is another example. I mean, interesting-ish story on its own merits, but had very little to do with Robocop.
I don't think Robocop counts as a nostalgic revival, though. I don't remember anybody being excited that they were doing another one of those. Like, people remember Robocop because it was a good movie. I don't think people remember Robocop because they're like, oh yeah, Robocop's back!
You just reminded me that Robocop is actually coming back again.
Ugh.
They've announced another reboot. I think Neil Blomkamp's involved, so it could go either
It
way.
could be, yeah, it could be better or it could be dreadful because his movies are either good or, yeah.
Shit house.
You can't get more blatant than Robocop. It's what we were talking the other week about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but, like, but times 10. Like, the whole point of it being called Robocop is because it's a ridiculous name. So bringing it back as if it's some special thing, I think, kind of, it's self-defeating to some extent.
There's also whether or not an IP has something like relevant to say in the modern era. Um, Robocop was kind of satirical in that it took a lot of the kind of 80s excess and pushed it right to the far edge of ridiculousness. But it's really difficult to do that now because a bunch of the stuff that we kind of like laughed at in the original Robocop is kind of stuff that modern corporations would entirely do or have in fact done.
Mm.
We are currently living in the shit future that the 80s was predicting. Like, there's really no space there.
So what can you say that the news isn't already saying?
Well, I mean, there's plenty you can say. I just have to say, there is plenty you can say. People write stories every day, and new stories come out every day that are great. Like, there's always crap, but there's also good stuff dropping. And the argument a lot of people make is, oh, well, you know, you can take the brand name Robocop And as long as there is a good story to tell, you find somebody with a good story to tell, and as you say, you sort of cloak their good story in the brand that people are familiar with. That's something people like to argue for. It's like, oh, what? You wouldn't have made this incredibly expensive, violent movie unless you could guarantee some return from the name recognition.
But that's not really fair to the original. It's not fair to an original story, an original idea, and people have worked really hard on this to strip that story of its individuality, to homogenize it with a bunch of other nostalgic properties. And it's also not fair to fans of the original, because you are taking a bunch of stuff that they liked about the original and kind of like throwing it away. It's the problem I had with the Knight Rider revival from, like, I think that was 2008-ish. Is I was like, Knight Rider's coming back, and Knight Rider is one of my favourite shows because I loved it so much. And in 2008, with the financial crash and like big business being a bunch of bleep expletive bleep, there was a lot of room for that kind of people who were above the law was specifically the target in Knight Rider. So there was a lot of catharsis that could have been gained from that approach. But instead they made it like, they're going after terrorist cells, and there's a bunch of people back at base who are like doing procedural drama type nonsense. And it's like, you missed the point. And also Kit was treated as a prop instead of a character. That really bugged me. So, yeah, by all means, like, revive a property, but remember that the property existed and was popular in its original format for a reason. Don't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and just take this IP and the kind of the skin of this and make it out to be something it's not.
Except that was ever the case is the problem, I think. Hollywood has a history from the beginning of taking things and throwing away what it doesn't like, and lip service and changing the name of the author, and like I mean, Die Hard's like a pretty easy example, I suppose, is like Die Hard was not going to be the movie it was, and every sequel since has started out as a different movie and then turned into a Die Hard sequel, I think is the story behind that. But it essentially comes from executives getting scripts, which can be these new creative things we're talking about, and deciding they like this or that aspect of it, buying it so they can use this or that aspect, and in some cases getting someone new in to rewrite the entire thing. So even on the production side, even before it reaches the fans, it's just always a case of things being bought and sold and rewritten, and sometimes the entire point of a thing is lost in between. It's not that it's new, but I think it's much more visible now with the internet and with the shorter hype cycles of introducing things to an audience using ads, like the Chippendale Rescue Rangers thing. That's so concentrated, and I think a lot of this, as I was saying on Discord, a lot of this is concentrated now because we just have such a instantaneous access to information. And Chippendale is also an example, I think, of something that will resonate with you both, which is like, sometimes they just have to make things. I mean, we all sort of agree, I think, from our discussions on arbitrarily creating new spin-offs in the past. We kind of agree that it's okay not to make something. You don't have to make 15 Star Trek shows, but they'll make them anyway because of the brand and the recognition and the money. And it's the same with something like Chippendale. we could sit here and say the original series it's based on has appeal that's to some extent universal, like it's a fun adventure show. Appeal that the movie's clearly not interested in because it's doing something different. But also, the thing it's doing different has appeal because they did it already with Roger Rabbit. They're doing essentially a sort of a mashup of lots of different cartoons and going in and out of the cartoon world and the real world, and it's been done several times, but we know it works at least once because it was done with Roger Rabbit. However, why isn't it Roger Rabbit 2?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are other interests involved. Like, we're not getting a new Roger Rabbit, which everyone loved, even if it would be the same as Chip and Dale. Because, one, I'm sure there are people who own that, like you've got your Robert Zemeckis and your Steven Spielberg who are involved, who would probably need to be paid.
The guy who wrote the original book as well.
Yep. And so, that's a financial incentive not to make it. And there's a creative incentive too, because if you're making a Chip and Dale spin-off for Disney Plus instead of a theatrical Roger Rabbit sequel, you have lower expectations. Like, people see that trailer and they go, oh, okay, they're not doing the thing that we know as Evergreen, the adventure cartoon that Chip and Dale was, but they're also not doing the thing everyone would be really excited to see, which is maybe a sequel to something that everyone loved.
This is the thing that confuses me. A lot of the time, these revivals are like, who for this?
Yep.
There's some Chip and Dale, it's like, I haven't thought about that cartoon in 30 years. I mean, it was great in the 80s and 90s. But it was like, if I think about it hard, I can probably remember the theme song, and they showed up in, Chip and Dale show up in Kingdom Hearts. Everyone remembers Gadget. But was anyone screaming for this to come back? And it's also, okay, it's a children's show. How many children are going to get the references in here?
Forget children. How many 25-year-olds aren't going to get the references either?
And it's also an adventure show with that kind of weekly episodic format, and the format was, oh, there's a problem that somebody has, it involves animals, we'll go and help. That's easy to get right. The blending of live action and animation is very easy to get wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So why are they choosing this format that's very easy to get wrong in a property no one seems to have been asking for, instead of choosing... It baffles me because this industry is like really risk averse, and yet they're choosing this really risky path. I don't understand.
You say the industry's risk averse, and that is to some extent consistent with it, even if it doesn't look like it from the outside. To some extent, it's consistent because somewhere in the bowels of the Disney Plus offices, they had people working on graphs of money going up, and a couple of lines intersected somewhere that said Chip and Dale return, Roger Rabbit style live action 2D animation blend or something. Like, somewhere it was someone's job to plan these things, and it just happened this way. Like, there's all sorts of things
that
they don't make any sense because they're driven... Yes, exactly. They're driven by information that we don't care about. It's like the people that they have come into focus groups, they want specific things. They don't necessarily represent what we think makes sense. Because they represent what people who happen to be hanging around a certain supermarket at this certain time and wanted to spend the next 2 hours like watching clips of things to get a coupon, basically. Like, somebody also
pointed out that there's kind of weird like self-selection thing going on with them, because the type of places that they go to recruit for focus groups tend to be in certain types of neighborhoods.
That actually reminds me of a little bit of sorry to get political, but political polling, because like you see it all the time, and then you actually look at how they do it, and it's like they ring people up on their landline telephones. It's like, who the fuck has a landline telephone these days?
Hmm.
So it's like, of course you're gonna
Is
get
it the
skewed.
70s? What?
Apparently,
Yeah, it's like, oh, who also are they getting the information from? Even if we talk about telephones in general, it's like who's more
mm,
likely to have a telephone? It's someone who's plugged into everything. It's like
mm. It's like, fuck,
some
I wish I
people.
could throw my telephone in the bin. Fuck, give me the shits. Um, But anyway, something that both of you were kind of talking about a little bit earlier actually just reminded me of of the podcast I was doing last year. We spoke to a woman out in Winton who was involved in bringing back this open air theatre that's been there for like 100 years, and it had been in decline, and they're bringing it back. And one thing she said was, and I think it's applicable here in a roundabout sort of way, because she said something like, in in the memory of the people who originally started it, who were committed to it in the first place, you can't just bring something back exactly as it was. You need to modernize it and give it a purpose in the modern day, so that then we can pass it on and be like, okay, well, here it is for the next 50 years. And I think that it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about sort of hollowing things out. But I think it's more than that, because it's easier, I think, to, as you were saying earlier, to sort of cloak these IPs, sorry, cloak these new ideas in old IPs, or to just, do something entirely different and call it the same thing, than it is to actually do that work to combine the old and the new.
Can we talk about some ways that are like some properties that have actually done it properly?
There's the big one.
Which
Go
is
on.
that?
Well, say what you will about the quality of the films, but George Lucas, throughout this course of his 6 theatrical Star Wars films, was definitely not holding back what he thought about America.
Okay. But they still, I
And
mean,
and actually, parallel to that would be the Battlestar Galactica reboot. So that's actually two space opera storylines going on in the sort of War on Terror era that were pretty clear about that stuff.
Doctor Who as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
2005
Oh, that
revival.
that early, yeah, that first couple of seasons was really good. With like every other episode was a lot more political than you'd expect.
A lot of people had like complained about that. It's like, oh, it's too political. Doctor Who isn't political. It's like, did you miss the entire like episode that was like a thinly veiled parody of Margaret Thatcher and her policies? And also the entire episode, which was about whether or not Britain should join the EU, and the other episode all set on the same planet, which is about the coal miners' strike. Did those pass you by?
I'd say it's potentially more ingrained within the sci-fi space opera genre that it is like always fairly contemporary. Like right now, there's the Twitter kerfuffle about Squeakcore, but even that is tied into the politics of today, even if they're neoliberal politics.
Yeah, I think I think, well, I mean, with sci-fi and, I mean, spec-fi in general, really, it is able to do that much more effectively than, I don't know, like contemporary dramas and action, like straight action kind of movies, because it does have that inherent distance. It's like it puts up this veil of like, oh, this is fantasy, this isn't real, so it can talk about real things.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry explicitly did this. I mean, in the '60s, and that
Yeah.
tradition was carried on into
You're
Next
right.
Gen and DS9.
Hmm.
You're right there, but I wouldn't discount what non-speculative stuff like your dramas and your action movies can do. Like
Oh yeah.
there's examples like I mean we already brought up Robocop, which is a sci-fi because it's robots and it's in the
But
future and everything. But there were other movies around the same time that weren't explicitly about the future. Like they were set relatively in the modern day, and they were about like police action and all sorts of things that were still fairly clear-eyed about what they were trying to say, and that continues up through sitcoms in the sort of post How I Met Your Mother phase have gotten really good at feeling a little bit more contemporary about the issues they're approaching. Actually, I think it might be Seinfeld that sort of started the way that a comedy can pick up on any random vibe that's floating through the ether at the time it's created and actually talk about it as if it's contemporary rather than your MASH, which is like, no, that's hard to disagree. I think what I'm saying is I agree that sci-fi can do a good job of it, but I disagree that it's not present in stuff like comedy and action.
Oh, I'm not
it's
saying
present.
it's not present.
The advantage of sci-fi is that that veil that you mentioned, that distance, allows them to go much further in kind of pushing the metaphor and the narrative home than nervous suits in offices in network television or film production studios would allow a contemporaneously set drama or comedy or whatever to go.
But
For example, in the 1960s, the whole like the black on one half and white on the other thing, that really hammered home a lot of issues that were so relevant at the time. Would that have been allowed, like that if you took that veil of metaphor away, do you think that would have been allowed on network television in the 1960s in the US? No.
I think maybe the intersection of these ideas, though, especially when we come back to nostalgic revivals of like brands, franchises, is the problem is that so many of the nostalgic brands that are being revived are in the speculative fiction sphere, and yet they don't take advantage of that. Like they fail. They fail in the sense that they're very banal by comparison. Like even The Force Awakens, which is maybe subject number 2, with Tron Legacy as subject number 1 for these Lego sequels. Even The Force Awakens touched on a couple of ideas that would sadly go unused as the trilogy sort of went off and had its own problems, about like neo-Nazis. Like at least for the first half of the new Star Wars movies, we had this potential interesting direction it could go, where one of the main characters was a radicalized, like sort of white supremacist almost.
What I'm wondering if this ties into is, I was talking with a friend of mine about this, and we were saying like the idea of the good old days. And the
Eek.
that conservative ideal of like whenever Britain or America or Australia, I'm sure you have the same problem in Australia, whenever the country was great, always seems to be when they were about 10.
Yeah. It's like, oh, what was the thing happening when you were 12 years old? Is that the best things we'll ever get?
Yeah. It's like, that's because your parents were shielding you from all the awful, awful shit that was happening at this time?
I do want to pick up on that in a big way, because that is, I think, fundamental to the second half of this conversation. But break time.
Okay.
Rebecca, what have you been vibing?
I have fallen down the Lost Ark rabbit hole. I was like, oh, there's this thing, and it's free to play, and it's an MMO, and oh, it's inspired by Diablo, you say, and controls much like Diablo. Well, you have my attention. And then they had to open like a whole new region, the West Europe region, because Central Europe had been absolutely clogged and had server numbers in the like 6,000 queue numbers to get in.
Wow.
But I managed to get in on the West Europe servers and have just been absolutely fascinated by it, because not only does it look beautiful, there's some interesting characters in it. The character designs are really nice, and it's also very satisfying to play because you get some amazing abilities that look brilliant and just like decimate your opponents. So if you've had a bad day and you're like, I just want to blow shit up, then you can load up this game and just like annihilate things in vast quantities, and it's very satisfying. And there's
That is
also like
very
a whole
cathartic.
bucket load of like interesting stuff to find. There's an entire thing called like hidden stories, which are not like indicated on the map or anything. You have to kind of poke around in obscure corners to find them. And they're kind of little scraps of lore and little bits about like side characters and things like that, which is very fascinating to me and gives depth to the world. A lot of games I think are missing this depth and the idea of there being kind of layers and you know, people having their own lives. So yeah, I've been really enjoying it.
Before we did take a break, you were talking about the idea of sort of the why of nostalgia, and I think it's like the wave of nostalgia that we're talking about. It's not new. It's like, yes, okay, so we're seeing a bunch of old stuff getting revived right now, but in the like in the 90s and early 2000s, it's like there was also this wave for the 70s and the 80s when you had like Forrest Gump coming out, which reflected on the older days, and even the Doctor Who revival, which you mentioned before, the first Charlie's Angels movies. And I think if you just look back through the history of pop culture, you see the same thing happening over and over again. Um, so the question I wanted to ask, and I think you already kind of answered it, at least within the way I think of it, is that I guess what do these recurring cycles of nostalgia say about us as a society?
As I was saying earlier, it's a yearning back to when things were simple, at least by your perspective. And it always seems to be that whoever is kind of currently of the correct age to be running film studios, game studios, movie studios, whatever, they harken back to when they were children. So they start like plucking out properties from when they were kind of like 10 to 12 and reviving those. The problem with doing this, and the reason why they tend to be neutered, as you were saying, Mitch, was that they at the time were being shielded from, you know, political issues of that day. So they feel the need to then like shield the property from these issues as well, to keep it kind of pure and safe and wrapped in cotton wool. So what ends up being delivered is entirely toothless and divorced from modern issues, because they want to yearn back to this time when they were safe and happy and everything was great. They don't want to look at modern problems. I mean,
Which is
yeah, it's
interesting, yeah, because the way that you pitch it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to say that is the psychology behind it, but it is also funny that like I can only imagine it's because maybe we all enjoy the odd creative writing here on this show, but I find the opposite is way more exciting. Like, I get the appeal of looking back to things that were big when you were 12 and loving those things. because when I was 12, I was discovering the things that I liked, and every time I came up across something that I thought, oh, this is what I like, this is something that I wanted to go further with, I would just keep looking. I'd be like, oh, I really dig this thing. Let's see what else is there. It was always fun. But I kind of prefer the idea of going back and examining things critically these days. Because you know what stories aren't doing when they're contemporary is ignoring the context in which they're written. You know, it's actually interesting because this is the same C.S. Lewis related topic I think we've touched on previously, but like he wrote books for specific audiences, and in the case of Narnia, wrote books for children. But if you read those books as an adult, they were contemporary, and they touched on aspects of what was going on at the time, even if you don't like to consider that. You just want to think of them as nothing but fantasy for children, and not consider the fact that they were placed in a time that he wrote them, and they have like historical events going on or allegory to historical events going on, and that's especially the case with things like Star Wars. I guess it must have been the last prequel trilogy movie probably came out when I was 13 or... I think I would have been 13 when Star Wars Episode 3 came out. And I didn't think it was about George W. Bush. Like, I was learning about the fall of the Roman Empire. So for me, the prequel trilogy was pretty obviously this classical thing, which, you know, to some extent it is. But it also was about contemporary American politics. And even though the movies themselves are take it or leave it, really, it's still way more interesting to consider them from the real contemporary political perspective that George Lucas was approaching them with. To me, at least. It's more interesting to realize that now than they ever were at the time when I was 12, thinking, oh, this is fun.
There's a difference between allegory and applicability. What you're saying about, like, oh, it's a classical thing, because history, like nostalgia, tends to come in cycles. So I was talking with a couple of people about Babylon 5 and the arc in season 3 and 4 with the Night Watch.
Oh, so good.
And how applicable that is to modern issues involving, you know, these neo-Nazis and the militia and the issues that people are having with the police. And some people who are actually saying, like, oh, it's directed at us and it shouldn't be allowed. It's like, this was written in the 90s, shut the hell up. But again, things tend to be in cycles, so you will get this happening.
Yeah. It's hilarious with something like Babylon 5, because it's written so precisely that I guess we look at it now and think, oh, it's amazing that this came out the way it did because it's so clear, and yet people still don't get it.
They have the armbands, people. How are you not getting this? But there's also the kind of the good type of nostalgia where you revisit something from your childhood and then uncover more layers to it. And as an example, I'm going to use My Little Pony. Stay with me. So during the original My Little Pony, there was a bunch of toys and stuff that were released, and Lauren Faust, who created My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, used to play with those ponies and invent stories for them. Their relationship to what was on the TV in terms of the cartoons was other than the names and kind of vague aspects of the personalities. And then she took those ideas and the stories that she was playing with these toys and gave them a more sophisticated spin and created Friendship is Magic. And you can tell by the fact that so many adults love this show that it clearly had something to say that resonated with a lot of people. Because she was able to take something from her childhood and not make it like cynical or overly political, but still have something relevant to say.
That's an aspect of it that people also tend to forget, which is it can be anywhere on the political spectrum. Like, it doesn't have to be skewering the right-wing American politics the way George Lucas loved to do. It can be, oh, this is how children play, and I'm going to write a story that resonates with how children play, and therefore resonates with everybody, because everybody started as kids. And, like, another example of that I was thinking is the Jerry Anderson Supermarionation shows. Because, like, those were very much of their time, and reflect a certain, like, I wouldn't say pro-military, but perhaps militarist and slightly conservative worldview, as progressive as you could argue parts of Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet were. Captain Scarlet, in particular, was like notably progressive for a 60s show. They still have a bit of a conservative bent to their politics. But even so, like, you watch them today and you're like, oh, that has a lot to say about when it was made. Like, these are shows that are very clearly the 60s, and they're talking about stuff going on in the 60s.
Oh, how would you make something like Thunderbirds work in the modern day? I mean, there was the Thunderbirds film, which failed spectacularly, because it was another example of kind of like creating this very hollow imitation of something from our history.
The closest I can come up with, because it's the puppet space, would be the Dark Crystal Age of Resistance on Netflix, which is my gold standard for, like, a brand, I suppose, because the Dark Crystal isn't really a brand. Like, they tried making it a brand by releasing some comics, but, like, I don't think anyone cares about the Dark Crystal, unfortunately. I love the Dark Crystal, the movie, and I loved the Dark Crystal show, and I read some of the comics, and I even, at one point, tried submitting in a competition I wasn't allowed in, all sorts of things. So I care about the Dark Crystal, perhaps in the way that most people care about things that are actually important. But the Netflix series was very keyed into the idea that you have to write a show for today, even though it's an expansion of a movie from the 80s. And if you go back and watch the original movie now, it's very much part of the conversation that was going on in fantasy and philosophy at the time in the movies. Some people even criticized the original Dark Crystal movie for being too much like Star Wars, which is very confusing to anyone in 2022, I bet. But at the time, it was part of a conversation in filmic fantasy and philosophy that was pretty much only going on in those kinds of movies. So you can kind of see why people would compare the two. And so the show, it takes everything that worked from the movie, and specifically it's a prequel, so it's actually setting up the movie. But I think the prequel part is less important. What's important is it then tells a story that is as relevant for today as a movie from the 80s was for the 80s. And that's something that everyone should take their inspiration from. They should be like, how can we take what we loved about this old thing, but not just regurgitate it, actually infuse it with the talking points of today. Even the sequel series to Avatar: The Last Airbender did that. Like, The Legend of Korra, it had several different sort of plot lines through its 4 seasons, I think, but each of those plot lines was inspired by what kind of a world the kids who watched the original show would be growing up into. So it was focused around characters who were aged up compared to the characters of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and the sorts of struggles that people who had grown up since the original show would have.
Yeah, I think the example of Avatar is interesting because there was such a short gap between The Legend of Aang and The Legend of Korra. In terms of like the productions, there was only a few years, I think, which I think, yeah, it still kind of captures, I guess, that same core audience of people. Um, Whereas something like Chippendale Rescue Rangers, as we were discussing earlier, it's like the people who were watching it in the 80s, sure, they may watch it in 2022, but it's more out of a sense of morbid curiosity than because they're genuinely excited about it. So, yeah, I don't know.
You could take a guess and say perhaps because of the timing of the original show, there's a good chance people who liked Chip and Dale also liked Roger Rabbit, and Roger Rabbit was the instigator for this sort of modern version of a cartoons meet reality storyline. It's the one that made all the advancements in film technology that make that sort of a movie possible, or at least believable. It's been possible since animation existed, but Roger Rabbit sort of codified it into something really special. And yeah, you could make that the argument that those two things were close enough together that people remember them both, and therefore making a cartoon meets reality show or movie today is aiming at an age group of people who is familiar with both concepts. But it's like you were saying about like morbid curiosity. I also get into this a lot on Twitter with mutuals who honestly just agree with me. Like, it's not much of a debate because everyone agrees at this point. But if you're going to make a Chip and Dale based movie that isn't what made Chip and Dale special originally, then what is your aim? So you're either using what Chip and Dale was and doing it again, which is what a lot of these revivals do, because they aren't necessarily just nostalgic. You might be thinking, oh, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a nostalgic revival because it keeps coming up and every new generation has Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to look back on. But Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is maybe the premier example of a slightly different phenomenon in children's TV, which is that like every 7 or so years they have to start it again because the children have aged out of watching cartoons. It's annoying to say that because no one has to age out of watching a medium, but once you go beyond 7 seasons of a show, you're talking to a different group of people, which is why they change it every, bit more than half of a decade. You get your new version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so if you're doing that, you're never aiming at the same people any one time. Like if you come along, Damien, and you're a big fan of TMNT, and you watch the new one, and it's got some of what made the version you used to watch exciting, maybe you'll like the new one too, but it's not necessarily for you in the way that some nostalgic revivals are. And so we're seeing now this mishmash of like, well, okay, so Chip and Dale, you could have brought it back at any time because it's a format that works, like Rebecca said. But you're bringing it back now because it's for people of a certain age to have nostalgic interest, rather than bringing it back like with DuckTales, which I'd argue was, it's a similar timeline, but I'd argue that DuckTales came back because of the hit of shows like Gravity Falls and Adventure Time, rather than because it was nostalgic.
There's also something to be said about how much space there is within an idea or a property for other stories to be told. There are some like films or TV shows or games where it's like you tell a story and the story is told, and it's particularly true if it's about a individual character and their individual arc. And once that story is over, then there isn't really much space within that to tell another story without retreading the same ground over and over again. So some stories don't have a lot of space to fit another story sequel in there, as opposed to something like Star Trek, where you've got the entire galaxy to tell stories in, or Doctor Who, where you have all of time and space to tell stories in.
Yep.
And they have run the entire
Rebecca,
gamut
you're
of
tempting
genres.
me.
Go on.
You're tempting me to bring up Final Fantasy VII Remake or Rebuild of Evangelion, because those are properties that play in a different space and tend to refute these kinds of structural issues.
Rebuild has a different kind of case, because it starts off like treading the same ground and then takes a sharp left turn into what the fuckville.
And I'm glad that we got here, because I wanted to bring this up, and now it has a reference point. You end up with people wanting to tell a kind of a story, and sometimes they associate characters and settings they love with that story. So, an example would be Avatar: The Last Airbender is getting a Netflix live-action TV show. It really doesn't need one.
No.
There's no reason, there's no intrinsic reason that you should remake something that already worked like that in a different medium that is still delivered the same way, like as television. There's no real motivation for that, and I'm sure people are excited, but no one I know is really that excited. But the people who want to tell that kind of a legends and lore mythic adventure, we're with a young boy who meets some friends, and over the course of several years of ups and downs and a grand epic climax defeats the evil empire. Like, it makes sense that people would associate the tropes of storytelling with the first time they saw it. And so them wanting to retell Avatar can be part of their creative process. I think it's kind of silly, but it makes sense that that's the case. However, it's wrong and weird in the post-Mickey Mouse era. In the last 100 years of companies trademarking characters and having copyright to stories for much longer than any one person used to have copyright for, it's a stranger time to want to retell specific stories. Because in the midst of history, when copyright wasn't a thing and trademarks were almost certainly around but were not for characters, if you wanted to retell one of these stories, you'd just retell it. And often people would retell it with their own changes. Like, I always hoped to see Robin Hood do this thing, so when I retell the whole ballad of Robin Hood, I'm going to tell it with this part that I've invented. King Arthur perhaps is an even better example, because his story from King Arthur's birth through to his death is kind of Western literature's like example of the epic adventure of a hero, in the way that Avatar is. You can just tell that whenever you like.
Also, a lot of
nowadays,
the more ancient legends regarding King Arthur are utterly ridiculous.
They're great. They'd make great
They're
TV,
brilliant.
by the way.
It'd make a great cartoon
Yeah, I mean,
show, actually.
The sorts of things that happen in OG Arthurian myth.
Yeah, the OG
But yes,
Arthurian myth
absolutely.
where Lancelot didn't exist. Guinevere wasn't unfaithful. Or Gwenhwyfr, as I'm supposed to pronounce it.
There's a lot of things too that, again, like, it would make great television. What happens to a horse at one point? You know, the different things that people do to get back at one another when they betray each other. There's a lot there that would make great TV. But
the fact that most of the
it's
knights
not a
have
brand.
actual
You know,
superpowers. I am not making this up.
yeah, it's worse now. Things can be bad. We can admit that things can be bad. And right now it's bad because we're obsessed with tying up our storytelling creativity inside of names and places and concepts owned by corporations. This is especially bad in sci-fi TV now, actually, because if there are 3 Star Trek shows on TV, like there were in the 90s as well, like, things can go one of 2 ways. Either it proves that people love that kind of sci-fi, and so there's a boom where other people are making shows like that, like your Babylon 5, Farscape, Stargate. Or, and this is so much more likely in the era of streaming, they know exactly who they're targeting their shows at, and they can make 3 Star Trek shows, and then everyone else who might make a show like that instead goes and does something else, because that audience is sated with Star Trek and they're not going to try and do something that's not a big brand.
This is why I am so active in the area of fanfiction. Because fanfiction allows you to take these characters and these settings and do stuff with them that the corporatized versions of these would never think of doing.
I also like the existence of fanfiction, but I think both of you are well aware that my thoughts on the matter are almost like conflicted, because I prefer when people come up with their own characters and settings, because I don't care so much about brands and franchises. But I'm willing to admit a lot of other people do, and therefore fanfiction gives you that creative opportunity.
Which is kind of... It's the same thing that makes people excited for revivals, and then can disappoint people as well. Because if what you are seeing in the revival is not what you pictured in your head, not what you remember, I mean, even taking into account the nostalgia filter, the reason I was disappointed with Star Trek Picard was because it's like so much of the kind of hopefulness and idealism that I love from Next Generation had been completely stripped away.
Yeah.
And that bitterly disappointed me, because it kind of absorbed modern cynicism. And I don't think that's what Star Trek is supposed to be about.
I mean, it's interesting because Picard is at least deliberately doing that. There are revivals, cynical brand revivals, that have happened in the last 5 or 10 years that even passively, like, they suggest that things are terrible. Like, I'm thinking, maybe not Ghostbusters, because I haven't seen that, I only have vague ideas of what that one is, but there are other brands that have been revived, and they're so, like, politically vapid, or disinterested in the struggles of what their stories are actually trying to tell, that they end up implying a universe of apathy and bitterness, even if they're trying to be exciting and fun.
It's what you said about, like, they have nothing to say except regurgitating this nostalgia from 20, 30 years ago.
Actually, I do have a specific example of a positive one of these, if you like. But in the new Matrix movie, which I really liked, and I know a lot of other people don't, there is a moment where they revisit visuals from the first movie in 2021 CGI. And the surface level meaning of that kind of sequence in any other of these Lego sequels is, oh wow, I get to see this part of a movie I loved done with modern graphics. It's so much more impressive. How exciting. And then the movie makes it clear that actually, no, this is really sad, because at the end of the Matrix trilogy, Neo thought he had changed things. And so for him to see things the way they were 20 years ago in the first Matrix movie is actually really, like, bitter and makes him think that everything he did was for nothing. And the storyline actually addresses that and goes on in interesting ways to prove that that's not the case. But it's interesting that the surface level of that sequence is the same as every other Lego sequel in what it's trying to deliver, but it actually addresses the implication that most of those other Lego sequels are also implying without addressing, which is that things should change, otherwise, what are we doing?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the idea of this whole episode, I guess. Like, there's so much of looking back, but it's like, at the same time, even if you are looking back, you still need to look forward because, you know, today is not yesterday, and tomorrow won't be today. So, yeah. Anything final that either of you want to add?
It's all very well to take a nostalgic property and revive it or reboot it, but if you're going to do that, make sure that you have something to say other than just, wasn't this thing great?
So I guess we'll end it there. So did you guys have any final plugs?
The Radio Sega team, including my husband, is taking part in the Game Blast charity event, which is taking place between the 25th and the 27th of February. It's going to be for Special Effect, which is a charity which helps people with disabilities to enjoy video games in a more full manner. My husband is going to be playing Tetris Effect, and if £100 is donated during his segment, he has to eat an entire tub of Twiglets, and he hates Twiglets and other Marmite-related products. Donate generously, friends, because I want to see his expression.
Anything from you, Mitchell?
If you're interested in rants like the ones I go on here, I do them semi-weekly on Twitter at Polygon Native, all one word. Yeah, I have a lot of opinions, and
You
they're
do.
all
You're
backed
so
up by
active on
nothing
Twitter.
much.
Yeah, I've been very boring for the last little while, so nothing from me. But if you've
Aw.
liked this chat, like, subscribe, find us on social media where, yeah, we're around. And I guess we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
Bye.